I never thought the night my daughter received the house would also be the night she erased me from her life. Sarah didn't yell, didn't cry, didn't use harsh words. Instead, she just stood coldly leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, her voice sharp as a knife. I think it's time for you to move out. This is mine and Kyle's house now. You signed the papers. Thank you, but you need to respect our boundaries. The drizzle stung my shoulders as I bent to pick up the shirt that had fallen from my suitcase. Kyle stood nearby, brazenly confident, holding a beer with the posture of a man who believed he'd won. We need our own space. We've got plans for this house. You'll see moving out is the most reasonable choice. Sarah didn't look at me when she said that. She just gently pushed the door, as if to end the conversation softly. As if kicking her own father out of the house was normal, no argument needed. I didn't respond. I didn't yell, "This is my house." I didn't mention the 30 years of mortgage payments, the 20 winters with a leaking roof, or the nights I spent tinkering in the basement to fix the pipes. I just zipped up my suitcase, carefully placed Elaine's, my wife's, photo frame on top, and stepped down the front porch. Each step was a layer of dusty memories. I'd built those steps myself when Elaine was still alive. She always said, "You do better than any contractor in town." And now those very steps were ushering me out of what was once my home. A month earlier, I'd signed the transfer paperwork, a suggestion from Sarah, who said she needed to be on the title to get a bank loan for renovations. I trusted her. I thought it was a logical way to help her and Kyle settle down. I thought it was the last gift I could give. But I'm not naive. I still remember every clause. I remember reviewing the papers carefully. I remember not signing an official deed transfer, only a temporary conditional use agreement. I remember it clearly, because I was the one who asked the lawyer to draft it that way. Sarah and Kyle thought they'd won. They thought they'd pushed the old man out and were about to make the house their own. They thought my signature was the end of it. They didn't know I'd never given them the most important thing. The rain grew heavier as I dragged my suitcase to the truck bed. I didn't look back. No need to glance at the doorway where Sarah stood, probably breathing a sigh of relief. I drove out of the neighborhood where I'd planted every lavender bush, hung Christmas lights every December. I didn't cry. I wasn't angry. I just found it funny. Because I knew something they hadn't yet discovered. I let them think the house was theirs, but they never checked the name on the deed. I still vividly remember that autumn morning when Sarah called, her voice trembling. "Dad, we can't manage anymore." I was sitting on the porch, sipping my morning coffee, when her choked-up voice came through the phone. Kyle had been out of work for nearly 3 months, and Sarah's hours at the travel agency had been cut. Rent in Portland was piling up. Credit card debt was nearing its limit. Their car was broken, and their health insurance had lapsed. I listened as my daughter tried to keep her voice steady, saying calculated words to avoid making me feel pity. But I knew. A father always knows. I told her immediately, "Come back. There's always room for you at home." Though I wasn't used to living with others after nearly 8 years alone since Elaine's passing, it was still Sarah's home. At least I thought it was. I cleaned the living room, fixed up the back bedroom, changed the sheets, bought a longer dining table. Kyle seemed grateful at first, not too bothersome. I gave him the keys to my old pickup truck, saying he could use it for job interviews. I doubled the household budget, now feeding 3 instead of 1. Electricity, water, internet, insurance, I paid for it all. When the water heater broke, I spent $3.5 grand on a new one because Kyle said he needed hot showers to stay healthy for upcoming interviews. When Sarah had the flu for 2 weeks, I took turns cooking soup, buying medicine, cleaning, and doing laundry so Kyle could focus on applications. 2 months later, when I asked Kyle if he'd found a job, he said waiting for the right opportunity. I didn't argue. I never wanted to embarrass anyone, especially my daughter's husband. I just thought giving them more time was the right thing to do. I even helped pay off nearly $4,000 of their old rent debt. Sarah cried and thanked me then. She hugged me tightly, saying, "You're the kindest man I've ever known." But then things started to change. I don't know exactly when. Maybe it was when Kyle suggested I put the house in Sarah's name to avoid legal hassles later. Or when he told me not to bother fixing the fence because it's part of the kid's inheritance. Sarah used to ask my opinion before buying anything, but then she started just informing me after spending. The fridge suddenly had wine I didn't drink. The living room had a new Bluetooth speaker. I didn't object. I stepped back. I told myself, as long as they're okay, it's fine. But Sarah's voice started sounding more like Kyle's. She began reminding me to leave the estate clear, and that Dad, don't take on everything. I'm here now. At some point, Kyle took the head of the dining table, and I was pushed to the edge. At some point, Sarah only listened to him, repeating his words verbatim. I once had a sweet daughter who listened, said thank you, hugged me on Christmas, and baked cookies like her mother did. But now I had a daughter who no longer looked me in the eye when she spoke. I didn't resent her. Everyone has their own life, and I never asked anything from Sarah, except that she lived kindly. Kyle was different. He calculated everything from gas prices to car repairs, from insurance to avoiding having assets in the old man's name in case he gets senile and causes trouble. I overheard him say that to Sarah through the dining room door when they thought I was asleep. I just smiled and turned off the light. Every dollar I spent those 2 years came from the savings Elaine and I built over a lifetime. Money she saved by cutting hair at home, buying secondhand, and never drinking coffee out despite loving it. We dreamed of going to Alaska the summer I retired, but Elaine passed a year before, and I used that dream to pay for the new dishwasher Kyle said was necessary because Sarah's hands are delicate. I didn't regret the money. I regretted how it all slipped away without a trace of gratitude. Those who once owed me now saw me as a burden, but that would soon change. I said nothing. I just observed, and I never forgot a thing, especially whose name was on the deed. That evening the air was mild, a gentle breeze rustling through the willows in the backyard, making the whole house seem to sigh after a sweltering day. I was watering the plants when Sarah stepped out, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. She handed me one and sat on the stone bench by the lavender bed Elaine had planted. "Dad," she started softly, "we need to talk about something." I turned and saw Kyle on the porch, hands in his pockets, his gaze distant as if everything about to be said was already decided. Sarah continued, her voice hesitant but clear. "You know, we're planning to renovate the house, new roof, paint, maybe redo the kitchen. But to get a bank loan, we need to be the owners. The house is still in your name, so it's tricky to file the paperwork." I didn't say anything, just nodded slowly. She looked at me, waiting. "We don't mean anything by it, just that if you agree to transfer the title to us, it'll make things easier. It's just a formality. You'd still live here, still be the head of the family." Kyle chimed in then, his tone casual. "Everyone does this, don't worry. It's just paperwork. Living together stays the same." I looked at my daughter for a long time. I'd held her in my arms when she had a fever at 4. I'd lain beside her every night after Elaine died because she was scared of thunderstorms. I'd cleaned out her college dorm room before she moved in, and when I first met Kyle, I thought he was okay, just a bit impulsive. Now both stood before me like they were proposing a transaction where they got the house, and I kept the title of family head. I nodded, I said, "All right, I trust you." But there was one thing I didn't say. I didn't sign a grant deed, the kind that transfers ownership permanently. I had my lawyer Curtis prepare a revocable transfer on death deed, meaning I remained the legal owner until I died. I'm no lawyer, but I read enough books and asked enough people to know that transferring doesn't mean giving up. And if things ever went south, I could take it all back without anyone's permission. But I didn't feel the need to explain that to Kyle or Sarah. They just smiled, thanked me profusely, and the next afternoon, Kyle scheduled a meeting with the bank to prepare loan paperwork. Things stayed normal for a few weeks. Sarah started talking about new kitchen tiles. Kyle had contractors come to measure, quote, "fix the heater, replace pipes." I didn't interfere. I still woke up early to cook breakfast, mow the lawn, make coffee for everyone, doing what a retired dad does. But then Kyle's tone changed. At first, it was offhand remarks. "The living room's a bit small, huh? Or your room's too close to the front door, makes guests uncomfortable." Then one night, as I was reading, he knocked on my door. "Sir," Kyle said, leaning against the frame, "we're thinking maybe you should move to the garage apartment. I cleaned it out. We could put a bed in, add a mini heater. That way you'd have your own space, and we'd have less hassle renovating the main house." I looked up from my book, straight into his eyes. "I'm in the way? That's not what I mean." Kyle backtracked quickly. "Just, you're retired now. A quieter space would be better." I looked at him, smiled faintly. "I'll think about it." Kyle nodded, looking pleased, as if he'd handled a tricky situation smoothly. I didn't tell Sarah about it. I didn't want to believe she agreed. But that night, as I passed the kitchen to get water, I heard Sarah whisper, "I'm not sure we should push Dad out there so soon." Kyle replied, "He's old, slow. We could use that room as a home office too." I didn't walk in. I just went back to my room, closed the door. But I knew the first blow had landed, not from my freeloading son-in-law, but from the daughter who once called me her hero. They thought this house was theirs. They thought I was just a shell and some goodwill to bargain with. But they forgot one crucial thing: no one can take what was never theirs, especially when they never read the fine print on the paper I signed. That Thanksgiving dinner began with the smell of roasted turkey wafting from the kitchen to the porch, mixed with the cinnamon scent of Sarah's freshly baked pumpkin pie. I set the table, folded napkins neatly as Elaine used to do. On the surface, everything looked perfect. steaming dishes, half-filled wine glasses, soft yellow light glowing over maple leaf decorations, but the air was heavy as lead. Kyle pulled out the chair at the head of the table, my chair. I said nothing, quietly moving to another seat. Sarah brought out mashed potatoes, gave a polite smile, then quickly looked away from my gaze. Throughout the meal, they talked as if I wasn't there, discussing kitchen renovations, turning the back room into an office, and how modern retirement homes are so comfortable. I ate silently, each bite sticking in my throat. As the meal neared its end, Kyle set his glass down with a clear clink, leaned back, crossed his arms, and spoke loudly as if announcing policy. I think it's time to be clear. This is my and Sarah's house. You're just a guest. The fork in my hand paused. Not out of shock, but because I'd seen it coming. I set it down, looked up. Kyle continued, his gaze unflinching. You're here because we allow it, but we need our space back. We've said it before. The garage is better for you. If you don't want that, well, there are good retirement homes nearby. We can help you find one. Sarah sat beside him, eyes fixed on her hands. She said nothing, not a word in my defense, not a glance of apology. I looked at her for a long time, searching for something familiar. A look, a dad, a sign that the daughter I raised was still in that room. But no, before me was just a woman silent as her husband kicked her father out on Thanksgiving. I stood, removed the napkin from my lap, placed it on the table. No one stopped me. Kyle nodded as if he'd won. The sooner the better, he said. We need to redo the room before Christmas. I went to my room, closed the door behind me, quiet as any other night. I wasn't angry. I didn't cry. I just felt empty, like a chair pulled from the dining table before a new one took its place. I pulled my suitcase from under the bed, the old fabric one Elaine bought for our last Colorado trip. I opened the closet, folded clothes, just the essentials. A few sweaters, 2 pairs of khakis, medications, reading glasses. From the drawer I took the photo of the 3 of us, me, Sarah, and Elaine, Christmas 2005, when the tree in the corner was still a true symbol of love. I sat on the bed, looked at the photo for a long time, then wrapped it in an old silk scarf and placed it in the suitcase's side pocket. When I walked out with the small suitcase, Kyle was plugging a USB into the TV, getting ready to watch football. He didn't look up. Sarah was washing dishes, her hands trembling slightly, but still not turning to look. I said, my voice calm, I'll move out tomorrow morning. No one answered. I went back to my room, closed the door. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat there, on the bed where Elaine and I once lay together every night, remembering mornings she woke early to bake bread. Evenings we watched old black and white movies. The bed was still there, but nothing was whole anymore. The next morning, it was freezing, the wind whistling through the door cracks. I woke early, made coffee, took a sip, and set the cup down. I wrote a note. Thanks for letting me stay. I'm leaving. I left it on the kitchen counter, grabbed my suitcase, and walked out the back door. Kyle didn't wake to see me off. Sarah didn't come to say a word. I opened the garage door. No bed, no heater, just the smell of mold and some old cardboard boxes. But I didn't go in. I unlocked the pickup, started the engine, backed out of the driveway, the suitcase rolling lightly on the back floor. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for certain. The place I once called home no longer had room for me. At least, not in the way they thought. And as always, I didn't need to shout or protest, because I still had an ace up my sleeve they hadn't considered, and it was tucked neatly in the file cabinet at Curtis's law office. The motel room I rented was on the edge of Fairview, about 12 miles south of the old house, next to a Korean grocery and an old gas station. It was a small room on the second floor of an old-style motel, thin walls, low ceiling, a window facing a parking lot full of dry leaves, and the growl of trucks every morning. I paid weekly, in cash. The landlord, a Filipino woman named Mira, didn't ask much, just said, as long as you're quiet and don't smoke in the room, you can stay as long as you want. The room had a single bed, an old wooden table with cigarette burns, and a chair with a slightly broken back. I set my suitcase in the corner, hung my coat on the hook behind the door, and pulled the file folder from the bottom of the suitcase. where I kept the most important things. That worn folder was the only thing I brought that Kyle and Sarah didn't know about. I untied the rubber band, spread the papers on the table. The sheets were yellowed, edges curled from dampness, but the text was still clear, neat. On top was a copy of the title deed for the house on Oak Ridge, the house Sarah and Kyle believed they owned. I looked at the bolded line, owner of record, Walter James Harper. My name, still there, unchanged. I flipped to the next page, the revocable transfer on death deed, the one I'd asked Curtis to prepare instead of the grant deed. Kyle assumed it was filed with the county recorder as required, with a clear notary stamp. Under Oregon law, I remained the sole owner of the house until I died, and since I was still alive, the entire property was still mine. I flipped further to the temporary use agreement Sarah and Kyle signed, stating the purpose as supporting renovations, not a permanent transfer. Curtis had stressed I keep the original, and I did. There were also some tax receipts, a handwritten letter from Elaine from 2003, when we'd just paid off the final mortgage payment. Her voice came back to me as I read her slanted handwriting. Don't ever sell this house unless you find someone worthy of living in it. I'd promised, and I'd kept my word. I clearly remember the day at Curtis's office, a year after Elaine's death. I went to ask about amending my will, but Curtis advised, Walter, if you want your daughter to live in the house without losing ownership, there's a way. Transfer ownership after you pass. Until then, every decision is yours. They won't notice if you don't tell them. I'd hesitated then. I'm afraid Sarah will think I don't trust her. Curtis looked at me, his gaze steady, not judging. You can trust people, but not paperwork. I signed that day, and now sitting in the motel room with no curtains yet, I thanked God I did. They thought they were clever, thought I'd given everything away, but they didn't know I still held the one thing that mattered. Control. I smoothed the papers, arranged them chronologically, placed them carefully back in the leather pouch, and slid it into the nightstand's bottom drawer. I locked it with the small padlock I'd carried since my construction days. That night, I sat by the slightly open window, listening to the street traffic and the smell of gas from the nearby station drifting in. No one in the motel knew I'd been a construction engineer, had my own office downtown. No one knew I'd had a house with a lavender garden and a framed family photo on the mantel. They just saw a silver-haired old man, quiet, renting week to week. But I knew, I remembered. And most importantly, I had a plan yet to unfold. That night, I slept well, for the first time in months. Not because the bed was soft or the air quiet, but because I knew everything was still in my hands. And none of them knew that one signature from me could take it all back. Because I'd never left that house, not on paper. And I wouldn't let them forget it. I sat in the corner of the small motel room, the dim yellow light from the old desk lamp casting shadows on the scratched table, where my decade-old laptop sat. The screen was open to Sarah's Facebook page. Her new cover photo, a shot of the renovated living room, polished wood floors, an Italian leather sofa, an oak bookshelf on the wall, industrial-style pendant lights. Below it, dozens of comments from her friends. Gorgeous. Looks like an interior design magazine. You guys are so successful. I scrolled down. There was even a video Kyle posted, walking through the house with a glass of wine, pointing out every corner and explaining their minimalist but classy style. In one clip, Kyle stood in the kitchen, saying to the camera, "We renovated this entire space brand new, all from our own budget. No loans, all self-funded." I let out a dry laugh, not out of anger, but at the sheer absurdity of the lie. Their budget, every cent came from the savings Elaine and I scraped together over 30 years. Money I used to fix the house, pay their debts, even buy the new Ford truck Kyle was posing with to show off the sporty front bumper. I clicked over to Instagram. Sarah posted a radiant smile next to her college scholarship. I took out a quick loan to keep her in school. Now she posted about being grateful for a talented and steadfast husband. And who was I in that story? An old man who walked out of their lives like a mere tenant. I shut the laptop, sat in silence for a long while, then picked up my phone and searched for Richard Curtis, Elaine's old lawyer. He'd helped us with the house purchase, drafted our wills, handled matters after Elaine's passing. I called. His voice was the same, deep and polite. Walter? My God, it's been years. Everything okay? I didn't answer right away. I just said briefly, I need to meet you. About the house, about some papers I want to be sure of. Curtis agreed to meet the next morning at his small office, still on the corner of 8th, though the sign was older and the maple tree out front was now bare. His office hadn't changed, the smell of old paper, leather from the sofa, and the wall clock ticking slowly, stretching time. I sat down, placed the folder on the table. Curtis put on his glasses, opened each page carefully. The deed's still in your name, as planned, he said, pointing to the italicized line at the bottom. Revocable transfer on death deed, owner Walter Harper. And under state law, no one can sell, mortgage, or renovate this property without your signature. I nodded, eyes fixed on the folder. Curtis looked at me, asked softly, what happened? I told him everything. From letting Sarah and Kyle move in, to the transfer of the house, to being kicked out like an unwanted item. Curtis didn't interrupt. When I finished, he sighed. They never checked the papers? I shook my head. I think they were too confident, or too stupid. He gave a faint smile, but there was no joy in it. Walter, if you want the house back, you absolutely can. They have no legal rights. I sat silent. Curtis continued, more serious. The question is, what do you want to do next? I didn't answer immediately. I just opened my phone, showed Curtis the photo of the renovated house with Kyle's caption, Live to enjoy. It's all from our hard work. Curtis looked at the photo, then at me. He didn't ask more. He understood. I didn't need to say it, but we both knew it was time to set things right. That night, I returned to the motel, sat at the laptop again, but this time, I didn't look at photos. I typed an email to Curtis. I want to start the process. We do it by the law. I don't want a fuss, but I want them to understand one thing. No one can erase me from the story I wrote myself. Then I hit send. Outside, the wind slipped through the window crack. I pulled up the blanket, closed my eyes. In my mind, the house still stood strong, not with brick walls or new wood floors, but with the truth. And the truth, sooner or later, would have to be faced. I returned to Curtis's law office on Monday morning, carrying a black coffee and a notepad with questions I'd prepared the night before. It was cold, frost still clinging to my truck's windshield when I parked outside. Curtis was waiting in the small meeting room, the folder already open, his reading glasses perched low on his nose as usual. He pointed to the copy of the documents in front of him. Walter, I've reviewed everything. He spoke slowly, each word landing heavily on the table. The house on Oak Ridge has never been transferred. You're the only name on the deed. I nodded, though I'd expected as much. So what they call being given the house was just their assumption? Curtis clasped his hands, looking at me over his glasses. Exactly. You signed a conditional transfer, a revocable transfer on death deed, meaning the house goes to Sarah when you pass, if you don't revoke it. Right now, all ownership and decision-making rights are still yours. I went quiet for a few seconds, then sipped my coffee. It had gone cold quickly. Curtis continued, as if he'd anticipated my next thought. I also contacted a friend in banking, Fred. It seems about 2 months ago. Kyle applied for a mortgage on the house. I looked up. Really? Curtis nodded. He listed Sarah Harper and Kyle Morgan as owners, but the application was rejected at the verification stage. No proof they were legal owners. No title certificate. No property tax authentication. No consent from the named owner. I wasn't surprised, but a bitter ache spread through my chest. So they didn't just want to renovate. They wanted to mortgage it, use it as collateral for a loan, maybe for investment, spending, or simply to formalize ownership. They didn't ask me, didn't consult, they just assumed I was gone. Does Kyle know the application was rejected because they're not on the title? I asked. Curtis shrugged. Likely, but I'd bet he thinks it's just a technical glitch, and next time, with some finesse, he might try to skirt the law. He'll soon learn there's no shortcut around legal documents. I leaned back in the chair. The room suddenly felt eerily quiet. On the wall, the clock ticked steadily like hammer strikes on a nail. The papers Kyle dismissed, that Sarah never read closely. The papers I kept not out of distrust, but because Elaine once told me, you need to be certain if I'm gone one day that this house doesn't become someone's commodity. I'd been certain, and now that certainty was the foundation for what I was about to do. I want to start the process, I said. Revoke the transfer. Restore full ownership, no conditions. And if possible, I want to send a legal notice to them, demanding they stop all renovations, and if necessary, require them to leave the property. Curtis nodded slowly, unsurprised. Do you want it sent as a warning or an ultimatum? I answered immediately. A warning first, but if they don't respond, then an ultimatum. I want it legal. No drama. But I want them to know I'm not dead. Curtis gave a faint chuckle, but there was no humor in it. All right, I'll draft the documents. You'll have them tonight or tomorrow. I stood, shook his hand, my palm cold but my eyes clear. As I left the office, the wind was still biting, but I felt like I'd lit a small flame, one that wouldn't flare up right away, but was enough to burn away the arrogance of those who disrespected the man who built the house they were living in. That evening, I returned to the motel, retrieved the folder from the drawer, opened each page, and read them like revisiting an old chapter of my life. Every number, every line, every legal stamp, all stood on my side. Papers don't lie, papers don't feel, and that's why they never betray. And I, at last, was ready to use them like a sword. Not to strike, but to clear away the dust of deceit clinging to the house I'd spent a lifetime preserving. I'd once thought that if I had to reclaim my house, I'd have to yell, pound the table, become someone else. But as I sat in Curtis's office on Wednesday morning, holding the draft of the first legal letter, I realized you don't need to destroy to reclaim. Just follow the law and a little patience. The first letter was a notice to terminate the property use agreement, clearly stated under Oregon Housing Law Section 90, where I, the legal owner, ended the right of non-contracted residents to use the property. The second was a notice to vacate unauthorized occupancy, demanding Sarah and Kyle leave within 15 days of receipt, or face a lawsuit. Curtis printed each one on thick paper, the red seal glaring like a slap to the delusion they were living in. I signed each page, my hand steady as stone. Curtis looked at me and said, "Walter, don't expect them to react calmly, but rest assured everything you're doing is by the book." I nodded. I don't need them calm. I just need them to understand. Curtis sent the letters via certified mail with receipt confirmation, no claiming they didn't know. I returned to the motel, finished my cold coffee, and opened my laptop, waiting. I'm not one for social media, but I knew that's where the first signs would show. And they did. On Friday afternoon, around 4:17 p.m., Sarah posted an Instagram story, a blurry photo of the kitchen table with the caption, "What's going on?" 10 minutes later, a photo of the letter half obscured, required to vacate the property within. I recognized Curtis's wording instantly. I leaned back in my chair, gave a faint smile. Kyle couldn't hold back. He went on Facebook, posting a long rant, starting with, "Today I received a threatening letter from someone I once called father-in-law. A man I thought gave us the house out of love, but turns out he's playing dirty legal games to take back what he gifted." The comments below were a flood of their friends piling on, cursing, defending, but none had proof. None cited a law to protect them. And most importantly, none knew whose name was on the title deed. I didn't respond. I didn't post a rebuttal. I let them flail in their panic like two fish stranded in a dried-up pond. Saturday morning, Curtis called. They've hired a lawyer, but their lawyer called me. After reviewing the documents, he was silent for nearly a minute. Finally, he just said, "We should advise our clients to negotiate instead of sue." I didn't need negotiation. I just needed them out of the house I'd built with my bare hands, with sleepless nights, with every penny saved since I was 35. I asked Curtis to send the second notice, this time a violation of the use agreement, stating that if they didn't respond formally in writing within 72 hours, I'd file a lawsuit in district court. That evening, I got the first text from Sarah, after nearly 2 months of silence. "Dad, what's this about? I thought everything was clear. You said I was the owner." I looked at the message, my heart cold. I typed, "You didn't read the papers." I never said that. The next text came quickly. "Kyle says the lawyer will handle it, but I don't understand why you're doing this." I set the phone down, not because I no longer loved her, but because love doesn't mean letting someone trample your trust. I'd given everything once. Now I was taking back what was mine, through the law, not anger. Sunday morning, Kyle called directly. I didn't pick up. He left an angry voicemail. "You're a sly old fox. You trapped us. But don't think this is easy. I'll drag you to court for fraud." I deleted the message. Nothing worth responding to. I didn't trap anyone. I just stopped letting myself be deceived. In my mind, every step was already laid out. It was just a matter of time. And I, for the first time in years, was in control, without noise, without destruction. Just papers. And papers, as I well knew, never lie. Monday morning, I was brewing coffee in the motel's small kitchen when my phone rang. It was Sarah. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Dad?" Her voice was hoarse like she'd cried all night. "Dad, what's this?" "I'm sorry. We were wrong. Kyle shouldn't have said those things. I shouldn't have stayed silent. I thought everything was fine. I said nothing, just listened to her heavy breathing on the other end. She continued, as if clinging to a last shred of hope. I miss you, Dad. The house without you feels empty. Please don't do this. Don't kick us out. We'll make it right. We'll apologize. Whatever you want, I'll do. I looked at the coffee dripping into the pot, the warm aroma rising. You're not being kicked out, Sarah, I said evenly. You're being asked to return what was never yours. The line went silent. I hung up before she could say more. 10 minutes later, Kyle called. Not a regular call, but a video call. I opened it, only to see his flushed face, eyes blazing with anger. You think you're so smart? He growled. You pull this stunt, think you're somebody? You think a few papers can kick us out of that house? I didn't answer, he went on, his voice losing control. I'll sue you. I'll let this whole town know what kind of man you are. A petty, selfish old man with no gratitude. You'll live alone, die alone, and you deserve it. I ended the call, sent the recording to Curtis. An hour later, Curtis sent a formal notice. As of receipt of this document, all communication from Sarah Harper and Kyle Morgan to Mr. Walter Harper must be conducted through legal representation. Any threats, insults, or disruptions will be documented as evidence in upcoming legal proceedings. Kyle received the notice at 2 p.m. I knew because 3 minutes later he sent me a video of him ransacking drawers, file cabinets, and boxes in the bedroom, where I used to keep house documents. He tore through folders, hands shaking with panic. Sarah stood behind, too scared to approach. I remember something with a red stamp. Dad signed, Sarah whispered. Kyle snapped. I know, but I can't find it. Where's the damn title deed? He even searched the drawer where I kept Elaine's photo, but found nothing. Because I'd never left anything truly important in the house after they started calling me a guest. I saved the video, sent it to Curtis. He texted back. Thanks. The more evidence, the better. I didn't respond to Kyle. Not a text, not a call. I let the lawyer do his job. Sarah sent a few more messages. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. I just wanted our family to be happy. I didn't think it would come to this. I read them but didn't reply. Because love can't be an excuse to demand property. I once thought my daughter was just influenced by Kyle, that if I pulled her away in time, I could save things. But her later messages, short, cold, sent by her own hand, shattered that illusion. You may win legally, Dad, but you've lost emotionally. I sat still, staring at the screen, rereading that line. Then I smiled, sadly. Maybe she was right. Maybe I'd lost in terms of trust. But if keeping the house where I lived, loved, and lost everything meant losing the daughter I no longer recognized, then I accepted it. I'd lived my whole life with empty hands. I didn't need to win to get revenge. I just needed to keep what was mine. And that house was blood, sweat, Elaine, not a gift to be mortgaged for a kitchen with a bar counter. That afternoon, Curtis called, saying the lawsuit papers were ready, just waiting for Kyle and Sarah's formal response. If they don't leave by the deadline, he said, we'll file for eviction and proceed with sealing the property. I nodded. Outside the window, the sunset stained the old rooftops red. I sat still, listening to the wind rattle the motel's thin glass, and thought, truth can be hidden by words but not by papers. And the papers were on my side. I still remember that winter afternoon when Elaine sat by the window with a steaming cup of ginger tea, watching snow fall through the fog glass. She was fading, cancer eating away at her body, but her eyes still held one thing, clarity. Promise me something, okay? She whispered, her voice like a breath. I squeezed her hand, nodded. Elaine pointed to the front porch, where I'd laid each plank by hand, where we'd eaten ice cream with Sarah when she was 7. This house. Don't let anyone touch it unless you're sure they're worthy. Not for the bricks and mortar, but because it's everything we ever had. I didn't answer. I just kissed the back of her hand and whispered that I promised. And I kept that promise in a way even Elaine couldn't have imagined. After she passed, I lived alone in that house for nearly 8 years. I did everything carefully, fixed pipes, changed light bulbs, kept every old item. But I also knew one day Sarah would want to start a family, have her own space, and I was ready to share. What I wasn't ready for was giving it all away without safeguards. So I started learning. At first, just short online articles, types of property transfer documents, transferring a house to children, what to know. Then I bought basic law books, studied terms like title deed, grant deed, revocable transfer, beneficiary designation. I wasn't a lawyer, but I was an engineer, and when I want to understand how something works, I dig to the root. I went to the library weekly, asked librarians how to search public records, asked Curtis about legal loopholes, ways to protect ownership without causing family conflict. Curtis, initially surprised, nodded after hearing me out. Walter, you're not paranoid. You're just doing your duty as the one left behind. He suggested the revocable transfer on death deed, a transfer that takes effect only upon the owner's death and can be revoked anytime. I chose that option. I signed, had it notarized, filed properly, but kept full control. I didn't tell Sarah the details. When she and Kyle asked, I just said, I've transferred it. They didn't ask more. They thought I didn't know the law. They thought a retired old man living alone, eating canned soup and using a flip phone couldn't grasp legal clauses. They forgot I'd signed hundreds of engineering blueprints, stood through inspections where errors couldn't exceed 0.5 millimeter. The law to me was just another blueprint, with logic, principles, and load-bearing points that if placed right would never collapse. Kyle was confident. Sarah thought I was frail. Both thought I wouldn't fight back, that if pushed out, I'd sink into despair or shame and disappear forever. But they didn't understand. I'd spent nearly 2 years preparing for the worst, not because I didn't trust my daughter, but because I'd lived long enough to know life doesn't reward those who give all their trust without keeping some for themselves. I'd forgiven a lot. Forgiven Kyle for breaking a window without apologizing. Forgiven Sarah for canceling my birthday dinner to see model homes. Forgiven them for calling me an outdated old man. But at some point I realized forgiving too much isn't noble, it's weak. And sometimes the strongest way to win isn't to shout but to stay silent. Silent, noting, preparing, observing. Then, at the right moment, lay the truth on the table with ink and paper. Undeniable. The biggest lesson I've learned in my life didn't come from books, work, or victories. It came from Elaine, who whispered in a cold hospital room, "Don't let emotions make you lose your guard." I loved Sarah. I thought that love was big enough to turn all misunderstandings into something forgivable. But real love sometimes is knowing when to stop, knowing when to say no. And I said it, not with words, but with the law. With signatures, with seals, with documents that forced their silence. And I would keep doing so. No shouting, no arguing, because I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I was the owner of that house, and on the morning of the eviction, the sky was gray and still. I arrived early, sitting in my old pickup across the street, holding a to-go coffee from the usual shop on the corner. Ahead, the house at 214 Oak Ridge stood silent, as if it knew what was coming. An SUV from the county office parked out front. 2 eviction officers in gray uniforms stepped out, carrying a file bag, clipboards, and the court order. Curtis was there, punctual as always, in a crisp suit and cold eyes. He didn't need to say much, just nodded to me from a distance, then walked up the porch steps where Kyle was waiting. Kyle wore a hoodie, hair messy, his face sullen but trying to stay calm. Sarah stood behind, clutching a bag, her eyes swollen like she'd cried all night. They said nothing as Curtis handed over the papers. Everything was done by the book. Polite, quiet, no missteps. The eviction order had taken effect the day before, and today was the deadline. No other options remained. Kyle stammered a few protests, asking about negotiation chances, or a few more weeks, but the court officer just shook his head. You had your deadline. You had warnings. This isn't about emotions anymore. Kyle froze, face flushed, hands clenched into fists but not daring to do more. Sarah didn't look at anyone, just quietly packed items into cardboard boxes. Inside the house, I knew, the walls still bore fresh paint from renovations they'd hired out less than 6 months ago. The scent of floor cleaner still lingered, but it all had to stop now. I didn't go in. I sat still in the truck, watching like a shadow of myself from 2 years ago. The man who'd walked out of that house in silence was now taking it back in silence. But this time, it was the silence of victory. Around noon, Kyle and Sarah left, each with a suitcase and a few boxes of clothes and personal items loaded into Kyle's old sedan. They didn't look back. Kyle floored the gas, tires screeching on the pavement. Curtis walked to my truck, opened the door and sat inside. Done, he said. They won't be back. The court has recognized you as the sole owner. They have no claims left. I just nodded. No joy, just a cold sense of relief, like closing the door after a big storm. 3 days later, I got a letter. Not an email, but a handwritten letter. Sarah's handwriting. A thin letter neatly folded in a white envelope with just a small note in the bottom right corner. To Dad. I knew it was hers the moment I saw it. I opened it in the living room of the house where she'd once called it our home. The handwriting was the same as when she was in high school, slightly slanted, careful. The letter read, "Dad, I don't know where to begin. No words can express my shame and regret right now. I stayed silent when I shouldn't have. I went along with someone I thought was leading me the right way, but in the end, he only pushed me away from you. I know I was wrong, not because you won, but because I lost something greater than the house you." Kyle and I are staying at his parents' place. It's cramped, messy, no hot water, no dishwasher. Every night I remember our kitchen, the wooden chair you made, the cinnamon you sprinkled on apple pie every fall. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I hope one day I can apologize to you, not through a letter, but by living more kindly. Your daughter, Sarah. I folded the letter, placed it in the drawer by the fireplace, where Elaine used to keep the letters she wrote me in our early marriage years. I didn't write back. I didn't call. I didn't text a single line. Some apologies don't need immediate forgiveness. They need to be proven over time. That evening I sat alone in the living room, the yellow light casting over every familiar corner. I opened an old photo album to a picture of Sarah in kindergarten, grinning wide, holding a box of crayons. I smiled, but I wasn't sad. I'd taken back the house, not just because it was property, but because it was memories, a promise to my late wife, the final boundary I'd never let anyone cross again. Sarah and Kyle might not fully understand what I did. They might think me cruel, cold, but I knew if I hadn't done it, one day I wouldn't recognize myself anymore, and that would be the greatest loss. I returned to the house on an early spring morning, when the sun was just warm enough to coax the withered lavender buds in the backyard to life. The familiar creak of the wooden gate sounded like a note I'd remembered through all those months. No one welcomed me back, and no ceremony was needed. I just pulled my suitcase over the stone path to the porch, placed my hand on the doorknob, the brass one I'd installed myself in 1994, and opened it with the same old key I'd never given to anyone. Inside, nothing was destroyed, just different. The house bore the marks of two people who'd tried to make it something that didn't belong to them. But every wall, every tile beneath my feet still knew who I was. I walked through slowly. The living room still smelled of industrial floor cleaner, but beneath that chemical scent I caught the familiar odor of the redwood floor, worn by years. I ran my hand over the back of the oak chair, the only thing still unchanged from when Elaine was alive. The chair wobbled slightly. Maybe Kyle had planned to toss it, but I tightened the screws with my old toolkit I always carried. It stood firm again. I went to the backyard where weeds had overrun the garden and the lavender bushes were cut nearly to the roots. I knelt, pulling each weed from the bed, yanking out thorny stems, clearing it all with my bare hands, as if soothing an old friend who'd been hurt. By noon I went to the kitchen, wiped the dust off the counter, washed the ceramic mug with 2 flamingos, Elaine's mug, and brewed myself a cup of mint tea. I sat at the wooden dining table, the table Elaine had chosen after 3 months of comparing wood types, grain patterns, and leg designs. She always said, "This is the table that'll hold all our memories. Every meal, every laugh, every argument will mark it." I looked at the tabletop, seeing the scratch from when Sarah dropped a fork at 4, a small burn where I'd set a hot pot down, and faint worn spots where Elaine sat reading every morning. I didn't replace the table. I just cleaned it, sat in my old spot, and let the sunlight spill over my shoulders. That afternoon, I went to the front porch and put back the doormat that read, "Home is where the heart is." I just set it down when I heard a car stop. It was Thomas, the neighbor from the corner, a man near my age, silver-haired but still straight-backed, who'd once helped me reinstall the TV antenna one winter. He got out of his car, looked at me for a long moment, then laughed. "Walter?" I can't believe my eyes. "You're back?" I nodded, waving him up to the porch. He looked around, saw me tending to the flower pots, saw the pickup parked neatly in the driveway, saw me in the familiar plaid shirt I wore when mowing the lawn. "I thought you'd moved out for good. There were rumors you got kicked out." I smiled. Not bitterly, not mockingly, just a light smile like the spring breeze. "I never left," I said, eyes on the sunlit porch roof. "I just let them dig their own grave." Thomas laughed heartily, asking no more. He patted my shoulder, sat on the steps. We talked like old friends who'd never been apart. I told him about replanting the lavender. He told me about his son bringing his newborn to live with him. The world kept turning, even in my absence. But this house, it had stood still, waiting for me to return. That evening, I turned on the kitchen light, pulled out Elaine's old notebook, the one she used for recipes. I made her favorite honey-glazed roast. The kitchen filled with aroma, the radio playing country tunes from the 70s. I set the plate on the table, poured a glass of red wine, and sat alone but not lonely. I felt Elaine there, in every scent, in the golden light from the ceiling lamp, in the gentle breeze stirring the curtains. I knew the past couldn't be reclaimed. Sarah might never truly come back as she once was. Kyle might resent me until his last day. But this house where I loved, lost, and lived was back where it belonged, not just on paper. but in the hands of someone who knew how to keep it. And from today I'd tend to every brick, every blade of grass, every memory, never letting anyone erase it again. Ran wrote that letter on a night of light rain, the wind tapping the kitchen window as if reminding me that winter was coming again. I sat where Elaine used to sit, on the wooden chair by the dining table. A cold cup of tea sat before me, a thick notebook open, and on it a crisp sheet of paper pulled from the bottom drawer, where I kept things not needed yet but might be one day. I took my fountain pen, filled it with ink, and began writing, not expecting a reply, not to send it, but because sometimes the most important things need to be written, even if only to be read once by the one who's carried them in their heart too long. I addressed it simply, to Sarah, my daughter. Dear Sarah, when you were little, every time you fell, you'd run to me, hugging my leg, tears streaking your face, clutching a broken toy. Back then, I'd say, "It's okay, I'll fix it." And I always did, from a doll with a broken leg to a chair with a loose screw. But I never learned how to mend a heart cracked by misplaced trust. I'm not writing this to blame you, nor to recount the past like a list of charges. I just need to say it, once, to make things clear. You were the only light left for me after Elaine, your mother, passed. I saw her in every smile of yours, every look, even the tone of your voice when you were sad. You were why I got up early to make coffee, why I kept this house standing, why I learned to cook, learned to survive alone after a loss I thought would crush me. So when you and Kyle came back saying you needed help, I didn't hesitate, I didn't calculate, I held nothing back. But maybe, because I held nothing back for myself, you thought I had nothing left to keep. I paused. The damp from the glass door made the room colder than usual. I pulled Elaine's wool shawl over my shoulders and kept writing. I don't blame you for wanting your own life. Everyone has the right to pursue happiness, even if it means I had to step back. I only blame myself for believing love was enough to keep betrayal at bay. I watched you change from your eyes, your words, the way you looked at Kyle when he spoke for you. I knew long ago I was no longer the only voice you listened to, but I thought if I was patient enough you'd come back. I wiped a small ink drop from the paper's edge and wrote on. Slower, steadier. You and Kyle thought you'd won, that I was too old to understand the law, too soft to fight back, too tired to hold on to anything. But you didn't know. I don't live by cold blood, but I don't live by illusions either. I live by clarity, by evidence, by ink on paper. You thought I signed that paper out of love for you, true, but I kept ownership out of love for your mother, and because I promised her, no one touches this house unless I'm sure they're worthy. And the day you let Kyle call me a guest, the day you stood silent as someone pushed me out of my own home, was the day I knew you were no longer worthy. You learned a costly lesson, not because I wanted to teach it, but because you forced me to. I paused, looked up at the framed photo on the shelf, Elaine in her navy dress, standing among the lavender, smiling, her eyes saying, "You did the right thing. You might think I'm cruel. You might say I won by law, not love. But I want you to know, the law isn't just a tool, it's a boundary. And anyone living in a house built by someone else's blood and sweat must learn to respect that boundary. I no longer expect you to come back. I no longer hold your old place in my heart. But that doesn't mean I hate you. I just won't let anyone step over me again. Because some forgiveness is noble, and some forgiveness is weakness." I closed the pen. The ink was nearly gone. I folded the letter, slipped it into a white envelope, no recipient written. I placed it in the wooden box under the bookshelf, where I kept things not sent but meant to exist. Maybe one day Sarah would read it. Maybe not. But I'd written it. I stood, poured myself a small glass of wine. Outside, the rain had stopped. Water droplets on the lavender leaves reflected the porch light like tiny jewels. The house was quiet, but no longer lonely. I leaned against the door, looked out at the garden, and whispered, "You thought you were smarter than me, and I was too old to know the law. But the law, my dear, is what I live by, and no one lives in my house without learning that lesson." Walter Harper's story is not just a family tragedy, but a mirror reflecting modern American society, where traditional values like gratitude, sacrifice, and intergenerational respect are tested by individualism and material pressures. In a country that champions freedom and ownership, the story poses a practical yet profound question. How do you protect your legacy when your own family seeks to take it? Walter wasn't a blind father, he was prepared. He studied the law, understood his rights, and quietly built a solid legal fence. Specifically, he chose a revocable transfer on death deed over a grant deed, retaining ownership until his death, a decision not only legal but wise in a situation ripe for trust to be abused. Notably, he didn't react with anger, but with knowledge and calm, fitting for the U.S. legal system, where documents, evidence, and proper procedure are the bedrock of justice. The story sends a vital message. Emotions are precious, but assets need rational protection. Trust shouldn't be a blank check, not even for your children. Practical advice for anyone in the U.S. Learn basic property law, draft a clear will, keep meticulous records, and don't hesitate to consult a lawyer when needed. Like Walter, sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's the smartest way to reclaim lost respect. If you found this story thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch more real-life stories that touch the heart. Thank you for joining Walter to the end of his journey. See you in the next video with even deeper lessons.